Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Peter Orzag, Director of the Office of Management and Budget. I'll give a brief overview, and then I will turn it over to my colleague, Christy Romer, who's the Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, to describe in a bit more detail the economics behind the fiscal year 2011 budget, which we are releasing this morning. That fiscal year 2011 budget focuses on three things: job creation, middle-class security, and putting the nation back on a path to fiscal sustainability. Before turning to the details of the budget, let me just give a little bit of context and background. We just came through a year in which a second Great Depression was averted. At the end of 2008, real GDP was declining by more than 5% on an annualized basis. At the end of 2009, it was increasing by more than 5% on an annualized basis. Although real GDP and the economy is now expanding, the employment market remains too weak. The unemployment rate is 10%, and there are now 7 million fewer jobs than in December 2007. That's why this budget includes important investments to spur job creation now, including the Jobs and Wages Tax Credit that the President spoke about last week, and including key investments in the drivers of longer-term economic growth, education, innovation, and moving towards a clean energy future. Now let's also do a little bit of background and context on the budget. In January 2009, the situation that was apparent at that point involved two key features that are still the case. One was a significant increase in spending from 2008 to 2009, and the second was significant out-year deficits. Both of those were already apparent before the administration took office. In particular, on the first case, in January 2009, several weeks before the administration took office, the Congressional Budget Office issued an economic and budget outlook. That economic and budget outlook showed an increase in spending as a share of the economy from 20.9% in fiscal year 2008 to 24.9% in 2009. The reality actually came in slightly lower than that, 24.7%. But the point was, in a slightly different mix, less mandatory spending, more discretionary spending, the point was that significant increase in spending as a share of the economy was already apparent at the end of 2008 and early 2009. Second, we also faced not only a 2009 deficit that was in excess of $1.3 trillion, but a medium-term deficit in excess of $8 trillion. And that came from two primary sources. The first was a set of policies, the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts and the Medicare prescription drug benefit, that had not been paid for. That amounts to almost $6 trillion with added interest costs over the next decade because those policies were not offset. And second, the effects of the economic downturn amounted to about $2.5 trillion because when the economy weakens, tax revenue declines and certain types of spending automatically increase. Those automatic stabilizers, again, added about $2.5 trillion to the projected deficit over the decade. Now, that is an explanation of the situation in which we found ourselves and in which we continue to find ourselves, but it does not explain the path forward. So what in particular are we doing to bring the deficit down from roughly 10% of the economy in 2009? Several things. The first step is to make sure you don't dig the hole deeper. We are particularly pleased that the Senate has now joined the House in embracing a proposal that the administration embraces, so-called statutory pay-as-you-go legislation. That is to embed in law the common sense principle that any new proposals or new tax cuts need to be offset so that they don't cause a deterioration in the budget deficit. If we had lived by this simple principle over the past several years, we would be facing out-year deficits that would be roughly 2% of the economy, and debt as a share of the economy would be declining rather than rising. Second, the economic recovery, which will ultimately take hold, will help to reduce the deficit from about 10% of the economy down to about 5% of the economy by 2015, because tax revenue will recover and those automatic stabilizers on the spending side will also decline. Our goal is roughly 3% of the economy, which would balance the budget, excluding interest payments on the debt. To get from 5 to 3, we have a series of proposals. The first is that we put forward specific steps to reduce the deficit over the next decade by $1.2 trillion, which would move us from 5% of the economy in 2015 to 4%. These steps include measures such as the financial services fee, which raises $90 billion over a decade, helps to repay taxpayers for the full cost of TARP, and also by imposing the tax on our largest financial institutions, helps to discourage the leverage that was partly the cause of the financial meltdown that we have experienced. Second, we allow the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts to expire for those with incomes above $250,000 in 2011 and thereafter, as scheduled under the legislation. That reduces the deficit by almost $700 billion over the next decade. Third, as part of our effort to move towards a clean energy future, we eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, which reduces the deficit by about $40 billion over the next decade. And then in addition to all of that, we have a 3-year freeze on non-security discretionary spending, which will reduce the deficit by $250 billion. Now let me be very clear about this freeze. First, it is not across the board. Some agencies and programs are going up, and other agencies and programs are going down. In particular, we're investing an additional $3 billion in education, because that's one of the keys to future economic prosperity, even while we're reforming those programs. For example, taking 38 existing duplicative programs, consolidating them into 11, and putting more emphasis on results rather than just funding. Second, we are investing significantly in research and development, including more than $61 billion in fiscal year 2011, which is up 6%, because research and development and innovation are also key drivers of economic activity. And third, we are investing in clean energy, more than $6 billion to move towards the energy sources of the future, working in concert with the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies so that we can become the world's leader in green energy. All of these together move the deficit in 2015 to roughly 4% of the economy, which, as I've said, is above where we'd like to be. To get the rest of the way there will require a bipartisan process, which is why we are calling for a bipartisan fiscal commission, tasked not only with addressing our long-term fiscal imbalance, but also producing plans that will balance the budget, excluding interest payments on the debt, by 2015. Finally, let me note that all has to do with the deficit over the next decade, making key investments in job creation today, reducing the deficit by $1.2 trillion over the next decade, while investing in education, innovation, and clean energy. In addition to that set of challenges, we also face a long-term fiscal gap, which is driven primarily by healthcare costs. And one of the reasons why the administration has been so focused on comprehensive health reform legislation is that it would not only reduce the deficit over the next decade, but perhaps as importantly, or even more importantly, put in place the infrastructure and the policies that will help to constrain costs and improve quality in the decades thereafter. And unless we do that, we will continue to face a very substantial long-term fiscal gap. Thank you, and with that, I'll turn it over to Christy to go through our economic assumptions.
Well, thank you. As Peter suggested, I'm going to take just a few minutes to summarize the key economic assumptions underlying the fiscal 2011 budget. As you may know, the Council of Economic Advisors takes the lead in a process that includes the Office of Management and Budget and the Department of Treasury to produce the administration forecast that goes into all of the budget projections. Our forecast was finalized back in mid-November, on November 17th, and so is based on data through the middle of November. Now, I should say right up front, as the professional forecasters in each of our offices who contribute to the forecast frequently say, we are economists and not soothsayers, and all forecasts have to be understood to be subject to substantial margins of error. And I would say, particularly in the wake of a severe downturn, such as we have been through, usual patterns surely provide less guidance than in more ordinary times. But we have certainly attempted to base the budget projections on our best estimate of what lies ahead. All right, well, first let me talk about our forecast for real GDP growth. And in this discussion, I'm going to focus on fourth quarter to fourth quarter % changes, because I find these the most